Hello, I'm Michael Torra, Managing Principal for California for the Raben Group. Thank you all for joining us today for Equity at the Forefront of California's Economic Recovery. Can our state continue to lead the way? A policy discussion brought to you today by the Raben Group and Mission Asset Fund. California has long been a leader when it comes to public health issues. Think about the campaign in the 1990s to ban smoking in public places and the benefits that resulted in for people's health. This year, it's been the early action by our state and local leaders to address and prepare for the COVID-19 pandemic that has resulted in California really slowing the spread of the virus here in our state. Of course, it's not a completely rosy picture. We grieve for all those we've lost, over 1,400 deaths in California so far. A spike in deaths just reported yesterday. But we're also relieved that the numbers here in our state have been much lower than many other parts of the country. But while California has really been able to help mitigate some of the worst health effects of this crisis, we haven't been able to escape the economic pain. Over 2.7 million Californians have filed for unemployment insurance benefits since this crisis began. Businesses are shuttered. Those workers who were struggling to make ends meet before this crisis are in extremely dire situations now. Congress and the president have passed 3 bills, and within the coming hours, we'll probably enact a 4th bill to address these issues. Together, it amounts to $3 trillion in aid for our health systems, for workers and for businesses. But many workers and their children are being left behind. This includes the workers who pick our food, who stock our shelves, who care for our elders, and many more. So that begs the question, which is really going to drive today's discussion, which is, can California do on the economic front what it's been able to do on the public health front? Will California be able to lead the nation in developing an economic recovery that is truly equitable and leaves nobody behind? So with us to discuss these challenges today are 4 esteemed leaders in their respective fields, and we're so thankful to have them with us today. First of all, our partner in today's event, José Quiñonez, who is the founder and CEO of Mission Asset Fund. He himself an innovative leader in developing financial solutions for low-income people. The Honorable State Senator María Elena Durazo, relatively new to the Senate, but someone who's hit the ground running, which is really no surprise. She comes to the state legislature with decades of experience and truly a lifelong dedication fighting for working people in the labor movement and beyond. Cynthia Buiza, Executive Director of the California Immigrant Policy Center, a tireless and successful advocate for immigrant inclusive reforms here in California and beyond. And David Rattray, who's the President and CEO of Unite LA, who for over 2 decades has been leading the organization in building coalitions and partnerships to create educational and employment opportunities for Californians. So thank you all for joining us today. It's really an honor to have you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before I start to jump into questions that I'm going to pose to you, I just want to say to everybody who's watching, again, welcome. And also, we welcome your questions. I'm going to start posing some questions to our guests, but we certainly want to open this up. For those of you who are familiar with our in-person events that we've held in our LA office over the years, we always shift this towards a conversation with the audience. Under these circumstances, it's a little bit more difficult, but we have a solution. You'll see on the screen a comment box where you can go ahead and submit questions. You can do that at any time, and then we're going to get to those questions and address those a little later on. So first of all, Jose, thank you again for the partnership and helping to make today's event possible. I'd love for you to get us started here in terms of just painting a picture of what's happening, right? What's happening on the ground. So I was wondering if you could just start by telling us how Mission Asset Fund's clients are being impacted by this economic crisis, cataclysm, and what patterns you're beginning to see emerge.
Well, thank you, Michael, for organizing this event. And it's always great to find excuses to work with you and your team. So thank you for that. I think at this point, there's no surprise that people's financial lives are in tatters. Not just immigrants, but we all have been impacted by this pandemic. But immigrants particularly are being hit hard, severely by the aftermath. And so for our clients, people are fearful. They're anxious. People have lost their jobs, or they're being forced to work without any protections. Being right there in the front lines of this pandemic. Right away, we started hearing from clients about not knowing how they were going to pay the rent or buy groceries or even pay their normal bills. And so we right away, we try to figure out, well, how can we step in and help in this moment? And so back in late March, we initiated a rapid response fund, not knowing exactly what we were going to do or how much it was going to be able to raise. But we just knew that we needed to do something because people's financial pains were so palpable, even immediately there. And so we launched that effort, trying to encourage funders, other foundations, philanthropy to help us, give direct cash assistance. And so since launching that effort, we've $10 million foundations, local, national, even some corporations that have contributed to that effort. And what we're doing, we're directly giving people $500 cash grants so that they can manage their life, buy more groceries, pay those bills, and then just kind of help them weather this particular crisis. But the impact and the anxiety is real, and it's something that I've never seen before.
Yeah, Senator. Be interested in what you're hearing from your constituents, and also as someone who has such a deep roots in the labor movement, also would be interested in getting your perspective on how this crisis is impacting workers and their families.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And building off of what Jose just remarked, not only Jose for what you hear, but for your efforts, not waiting and doing something. I think that's a really amazing attitude to have in this crisis. But what I hear on the ground is childcare providers who don't have the cleaning supplies and don't have diapers to be able to keep their childcare centers open, because that's what you need. I've been through food distributions, thousands of people in line, thousands in their cars, hour after hour, coming up, waiting in line that long for a box and a bag of food. Trying to, colleagues of mine in Los Angeles, legislators, going out and looking for donations of PPE because our healthcare workers don't have the equipment to be able to do their job. The EDD, Employment Development Department, is overwhelmed and just bursting at the seams, even though they've added 700 or 800 additional workers, 7 days a week assistance, which of course is causing anxiety amongst those who, need that money. They need that money now. But what I found overall is that what many of us work with already is the inequality and the poverty that already existed is much deeper now. And it's amplified, and we need to pay attention to it. So the safety net programs that we have, what are the holes in those safety net programs that still exist, in even worse now going through this pandemic? And just to give an example, the undocumented working men and women in California and across the nation. So at the federal level, they have been explicitly denied and excluded from any assistance. The federal government went even so far as to say, if you're a citizen married to an undocumented, you don't have the right to any kind of the dollars that are giving directly. So where do they go? What do they do? They're not part of the official safety net. How are they going to just survive and put food on the table when they're excluded? That's what's going on, and we've got to pay attention to that in a way that doesn't ignore it and pretend like let's get on with the majority of people and keep them out. We've got to be much more thoughtful in the way we do a recovery, in the way we get out of this pandemic.
Yeah. And we're going to get to those kind of questions in a little bit here, but I still want to go around. And since, Senator, you raised the issue of immigrants, I do want to go to Cynthia next. Of course, immigrants make up a third of California's workforce, right? So this is not just incidental. And as I like to say, California can't work without immigrants, right? And the California Budget Policy Center put out a fact sheet last week, and this was very compelling, in which it shared that 1 in 4 immigrant workers in California are employed in an industry highly affected by the COVID-19 economic shutdown. And among undocumented workers, that's 1 out of every 3 that are working in an industry highly affected by the shutdown. So the impact is enormous. So Cynthia, I'd love to hear from you just what you're hearing from folks on the ground and your partners about how this is impacting immigrant workers and their families.
Thank you again, Michael and the Raben Group, for inviting us to this conversation. As Jose and the good senator already alluded to, many immigrant families are going through multiple levels of vulnerability right now. And I want to say that life for immigrant families was already hard before this pandemic. We are aware, and many in our audiences are aware, that immigrant families have been living in crisis mode for a while. Part of it is because of the anti-immigration policies that's been in place for a while. And now many are jobless, does not have access to healthcare or unemployment insurance, are on the verge of hunger and desperation. And if we do not address the gaps that exist in both our state and federal responses, these conditions could be exacerbated. Many of them live with or are older adults living with chronic conditions such as diabetes, heart or respiratory problems, which makes healthcare such an important resource. Some are afraid to tell their employers that they are sick for fear of losing their jobs. One of our partners just told us that this community member decided to go to work even if he had a fever because he was afraid of losing income. Many have lost their jobs and are relying on the help of relatives who themselves need help. And many are now on the verge of bankruptcy or are going bankrupt because many are unbanked, as we know, and also don't have enough money saved for rainy days. So those who are called essential workers do not have the luxury of working remotely. And this makes even more their situation dire. And I want to emphasize that, as you pointed out, the report from the Budget and Policy Center, the enormous contributions that immigrants contribute to the California economy, and they are largely excluded from many of the relief packages that have now come out, except for what we will talk about later in terms of what California has done. But I want to emphasize that immigrant workers are essential to the workforce. They are farm workers, they are healthcare workers, restaurant workers who are frankly helping to keep many of us alive at the moment. Yet despite the many significant contributions that they provide to our country and the state, they are continually and constantly excluded from these types of relief packages. And Senator Durazo pointed out, we need to correct that. And that for now and future crises, this has to stop. We cannot keep picking winners and losers in situations where enormous members of our populations are suffering.
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. David, as someone whose work centers around education and workforce development opportunities and promoting those, it's just got to be so disheartening to see these unemployment numbers. Can you tell us about the impact that you're seeing, both from the employer side as well as from the workforce development side?
Sure. And let me just also thank the Raben Group and Mission Ventures and you, Michael and Jose. It's an honor to be with my colleagues here. And I'll just say the same thing, but through a different lens. The sort of tale of two cities is just playing out in even a worse nightmare than we entered into this reality, the haves and have-nots. I think we're seeing some employers that are, let's say, some of the big corporations where some of the professional staff, a lot of them are white males of privilege like myself, are somewhat immune from this and sort of not affected radically. And yet we see others that my colleagues just mentioned that are having just horrific ramifications. And so I think our tale of two cities got worse. And yet I do want to acknowledge too that we have a moment of opportunity too. We have to challenge ourselves because we knew we had these underlying structural challenges with racism, with other inequities, gender, whatnot. And we all were trying in some ways to confront them. And the stakes just went way up. But I think with that can become a determination. And I think employers, we don't want employers to be to pull for their lesser side. We want it to pull for their better side. And employers, I think, obviously want to get back to business, but we don't want employers and any of us to be faced with, is my choice between economic benefit and people dying? That is the wrong way to be confronted. And yet employers and many of us feel confronted by that. So we have to find our way to a third way, which is people's health and well-being always should be first. And economic success should come from that and be after that, but not in competition with that.
Thanks, David. So Senator, sorry, Jose, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to go back to the senator. Senator, you were beginning earlier to talk about some of the kind of policies and measures that would be needed. I know you're, of course, the vice chair of the California Latino Legislative Caucus, and the caucus has been very vocal about the need for the state to provide economic relief to undocumented workers and farm workers and others, as I think you've already articulated. So thank you for that. What kind of other economic relief are you talking about with your colleagues in terms of what we're going to need in California?
Well, let me just say that the three priorities that the Latino Caucus has raised. One is about having access in the same way that some programs provide already for undocumented to be treated in the same way. They put into the system like other workers. They should be able to, at the time of need, get out of the system. So the unemployment insurance does not function that way, but disability functions that way, disability insurance. Workers' compensation functions that way. In-state tuition functions that way. We have driver's license. There's a little distinction that is made, but that's only because of the federal regulations. But here amongst Californians, we're all Californians. So there are great examples of how California has taken the lead across the nation. And it should apply to unemployment insurance in the same way. Employers pay into it for them. They pay billions in taxes. So that's one piece that I think is important. The other is we have tried, and we got pretty close last year, which is to be able to use the ITIN number instead of or in addition to instead of a social security number, to be able to access the earned income tax credit. That's something, of course, you have to prove you're working, and then you get that tax credit for yourself and or your children, when you do your income taxes. So that should be available to I-10 holders and not just social security number holders. Medi-Cal, we've gotten this far as Medi-Cal based on income levels only, from 0 to 26 years of age. The governor had agreed to put in seniors, undocumented seniors over 65 in the January budget. It was in the budget. We are urging that not only that it not be pulled, but in fact, it should be expedited starting in June and not wait until January. So there are things, of course, that have to do, they're very economic issues, are housing. How do people stay in their homes? And so we have to find the way, the policy in 3 months or in 2 months now, when there will no longer be a protection from eviction. How do those families that didn't have the money in the first place to pay for their rent, how are they going to be able to pay for 3 months worth of rent? So we need to be able to protect people, both mortgage holders as well as renters, as well as small business commercial holders, from being evicted from their locations. So those are just some examples. I think housing should not be seen as a drag on us. Housing should be seen as part of a more vibrant economic recovery, because it produces jobs and it produces housing. There's actually all of that comes together. So those are just some examples. I hope David talks in education, talks about the digital divide, that we have to have a new policy, because that's really hit us right smack in the face. So there's just some of the examples.
Great, thank you. So let's go to David then next, as the senator queued you up there.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this is a good example of a pernicious problem that we were trying to solve, but didn't measure up. We didn't do the courageous, creative work we needed to. And then we hit this wall where suddenly all of our students are at home, and other people are at home, and yet they aren't connected to some of the best sort of content we actually did provide. And then affluent students can get that, but our immigrant students and some of our low-income students cannot. But I think, our challenge is we need a new deal. We need the kind of thinking that FDR did, which is, if we commit to building the broadband access in every community, whether it's an inner city low-income community, or whether it's a tribal, it's a rural community, or in a tribal nation, geographic, we should build the infrastructure once and for all that makes sure that regardless of your income, you have full broadband, the same as you would if you lived in Beverly Hills. And you have the devices, and you have supports, training and supportive help to do it. And so to me, that's an opportunity of turning this disaster into something that is a lasting legacy of benefit, and that attacks inequities in a more permanent way, or at least a more significant, sustainable way. So I think Maria Elena is exactly right. I mean, we have to think about this broadband issue as another form of inequity and structural racism and inequity that existed. I mean, I'll just add a different dimension too, Michael. We haven't faced over the last century that we still have segregation in this country. And we've talked about us integrating schools, but in the end, our communities are still segregated physically. And in this moment, the segregation is echoed by the fact that people that are affluent literally could shelter in their homes. And as the senator just mentioned, we have people that are homeless, or people that are going to become homeless. And we're so separated from each other physically. So that we have to rethink how we fully integrate our society in a positive way, including geographically, including the physical integration of our communities and of our immigrants and our citizens.
Thanks. And you've spoken about the needs of students, in particular low-income students. So I'd like to go to Jose next on that point. Jose, I know that Mission Asset Fund has partnered with the College Futures Foundation to support lower-income college students, including those who are housing insecure, undocumented, foster youth, et cetera. So would love for you just to share more about that work, and then also kind of your thoughts in terms of some of these systemic needs.
I think a lot of things need to change. I mean, I think that's one of the things we can all agree on, right? And from my perspective, one of the things that needs to change is the narrative or the way what we think about poor people. Because in our society, we've always blamed poverty on poor people. It's like they're bad choices. They're too lazy. They're too dumb. They're making all the wrong choices. And then that narrative, in my mind, has to change, because right now people are hurting not because of their choice. They're not losing. They're losing the jobs not because of their choice. It's because we're all connected into the world, right? And then this pandemic is showing that. So I think that's one of the, in my mind, one of the key elements that we need to sort of change narrative so that we can allow for a new vision about what this social safety nets can look like to encompass everyone. I mean, I love what you mentioned, that we're all Californians in California, and I think that's exactly right. Then we need to ensure that we're all seen as equal, that we're all seen as deserving, that we're all seen as that we belong, in the society. And so I think there's a moment, in this current crisis to elevate that idea even more so. With our work with the College Futures Foundation, is really interesting, where Monica Lozano, she's a president of that foundation. She reached out, to me right away, saying we need to do something, because this crisis is really hurting college students in a negative way, and then she was afraid that the crisis will jeopardize their college careers. That some people might actually get off track because of colleges closing down, people losing their housing, people losing their work study, people losing their their sense of income in that sense, right? So she wanted to do something right away. So she came in, proposed a joint partnership. She devoted $1 million from her foundation to support students. And then she went out and found other foundations to match that, and ultimately, she was able to raise $2.3 million to help college students in California with $500 grants. And so what we did was to say, well, we'll manage that, we'll operationalize that, we'll make sure that 100% of that money gets actually sent to the students directly without losing any value. And so we, got ourselves together. We organized an application, and we went live with it. Our systems crashed because it was so overwhelmed. People wanted to apply, to the point where we had to put a sign-up sheet, like a wait list, little form, put in your name and email, and we'll get back to you. So within 24 hours, we had 67,000 people sign up. 67,000 people said, I need help. I'm afraid. I'm anxious. I don't know what's going to happen, with this. And so what we've done since then is we were able to survey those students a little bit more, try to find exactly who are able to help, and then thus we've been able to actually send out more than 1,200 grants as of this morning, and we're in line of making 4,000 grants by the end of next week. And of course, I want to give all the credit to Monica Lozano and her team at College Futures for having the vision and the foresight of stepping up and wanting to do something. But I also wanted to point something that we have as MAF, is that we have this infrastructure. We have the pipes, if you will, of being able to directly deposit $500 in people's checking accounts. We're able to do that efficiently, without wasting any value, in the process. And so we've learned a lot about, from working with that community, and now we're helping undocumented, immigrant families that are not students, but also helping them in the same way with a similar $500 contribution. And then we raised $4 million just to do that. And then we work with that SNAP Foundation in LA to help people that are in the creative economy, to also help them in that regard. And so, there's a lot of interest. And I think in this pandemic, in the crisis, a lot of people are stepping up. And I think this is the moment where we all need to step up. We all need to do something. We cannot just wait, for this organization or government or this corporation to do it, or some celebrity come and save us. We don't need that. We all need to do something. And so we're just doing our part, and then demonstrating that we can actually do it, really well.
That's fantastic and very inspiring. Thank you, Jose. Cynthia, I wanted to go to you on the theme of what state and federal policies are doing, and specifically, I know we've heard already about how immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, are being left out of the federal response. The governor announced the creation of this $125 million fund to be able to help them, since the federal government didn't help them, even though I think, as you pointed out there, they pay billions of dollars in taxes. Could you share with us your just thoughts on that fund, to what extent it will help fill in the gaps, and to what extent maybe it won't?
Great. Yes, but before I do that, I want to first share how the federal relief package is playing out on the ground, because it's important to also emphasize that. I want to say at the outset that legal permanent residents, DACA, and temporary protected status recipients can access some type of unemployment insurance. But again, here is where the challenge lies, because as we already pointed out earlier, many undocumented workers, period, are ineligible for the expanded unemployment insurance benefits. At the same time, at the onset of the program for small business loans, there was not a lot of detail on whether small businesses had to prove that their employees have work authorization. And so there's a lot of murky details still on the implementation of this relief package. Street vendors, obviously, cannot apply for a small business loan, as they're mostly anonymous businesses. There were a lot of technical barriers, even both for organizations and immigrant-owned businesses in terms of applying, including the need for access to technology, access to computers, access to the internet, as well as really language access. We always forget that we are a very multilingual society at this point, and that this has really helped to kind of worsen the lack of efficacy on the ground for this relief package. In terms of the California response, the $125 million that the governor unveiled a few days ago, it's a partnership between the state and members of the philanthropic community, where about 150,000 undocumented immigrant workers and their families are going to benefit. I do have to say that is a drop in the big bucket, because it really just will help about 10% of the nearly 1.5 immigrant workers that are toiling in the different sectors and industries and are part of our workforce. So that breaks down into about $500 per adult, with a cap of $1,000 per household, to deal with the specific needs arising from this pandemic. The $75 million is coming from this consortium of funders who they're called the Immigrant Resilience Fund, and implementation details are now being worked out with the different government agencies that will be involved, as well as advocacy organizations that are going to be part of the implementation. So I encourage interested members of the audiences who want to help communities avail of this to really make sure you go to the Department of Social Services, website and contact organizations that you work with on how you can avail of this as soon as possible. Information is key. The right information is key, because we should remember immigrant communities are also afraid at the moment. And there's always a barrier to access just because of the fear. So we want to make sure that we're not only working with trusted allies on this and trusted implementers, but we make sure that we message this around, that this is for everybody and there's no consequences for folks who want to avail of this. In addition, I just wanted to include the fact that the state is significantly expanding staffing for the Employment Development Department to speed the pace of unemployment checks for Californians who have lost their jobs. So that's where more or less that initial relief package from the state is going to come from, is what it's going to do. But as I said, it's a stopgap measure. And it's really, when we talk about vulnerable populations, we have to remember that it's a big number of people, and histories of inequities that has been experienced by these populations have compounded their vulnerability. We need to think of it that way. It can't be like a checklist, check, I have answered the call of this population and I'm okay. No, that's not the case. Where folks are going to be living the aftermath of this crisis a long way from the time we stop sheltering from home. And we need to be thinking longer term in that regard, in how we can really make California a place of inclusivity, because CIPC, the organization that I work for, believe that when we protect others, we also protect ourselves.
Right. Thank you, Cynthia. One recurring theme that's been coming up, just I think in all of your comments, for all of our speakers, is this great sense of togetherness that exists in California, as well as this sense, and I think Jose, you articulated that very well, in terms of just people stepping up and doing their part, right, and not just waiting for others to come and do that. David, I was wondering if maybe you had some additional perspectives on that, just thinking of the various partners that you work with.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Jose, too, for teeing up this idea that, we all can lead and all can step up. We all must. I found myself reflecting, and I've heard many others trying to draw on our experience. Those of us that are a little older, that's what we would do, of course. And in my adult age, I've lived through 4 recessions. I think since birth, probably about 7 or 8, but I won't mention that. And yet, as I think about that, I've never experienced this. I don't know who has. So I think this calls for a moment of humility for all of us. There's irrespective of our own responsibilities and positions of influence. Because when have we ever faced a recession and a health crisis which is killing people? I can't think of any time we shut down our economy properly for the right reasons to save lives, and now we have an economy largely shut down, and we're trying to contemplate reopening against the backdrop of, if we do reopen, are we going to kill people? So I just think it's important to be humble about this. None of us know how to do this. We have never done this before in the United States or anywhere. And but I think it requires courage of leadership, because we have to try, right? We have to take chances and make it happen. I think it calls for determination. We have to be determined to deal with these underlying issues of racism and other inequities in our institutions and our culture. But then the secret weapon I think we have is creativity and imagination. California has been the powerhouse of creativity and imagination for the whole globe for a century. And yet sometimes that creativity has been on the side of making money and making the wealthier. And other times that creativity has been on the side of vulnerable populations in solving in good ways. So I think it needs to be the latter, or some combination of how do we unleash our leadership in a humble way, in a determined way, with courage, but to really use our imagination and our creativity to do it in a way that lifts the most vulnerable. So when we come out of this recession, we don't come out with the rich being richer. We come out with those that are most vulnerable being better off than they've ever been before.
Right. So let's, I'd love to do kind of like a quick round with you all. And we've already heard several kind of like policy ideas on how we do that, right? And of course, we know additional policy ideas will be emerging in the weeks and months ahead, but would love to kind of hear from each of you. Before I do that, I just want to remind everybody who's watching that you can pose questions as well. We've already gotten several good ones. Just put them into the comment box that's on the screen so that we get those. And then after we do this round, I want to start taking some of those questions from the audience. So quickly, in terms of additional policy ideas that either you're thinking or you're talking about with your colleagues that you're hearing about that you think are exciting, Senator, I'd love to start with you. I know that you and your colleagues between now and June 15th have to kind of figure out what you're going to do with the state budget and approve it, right? Obviously, the state budget that was presented at the beginning of the year really is out the window, right? It's a whole new ballgame now. So I'd just be curious to hear what you're talking about with your colleagues in terms of how that's going to shape up and what kind of ideas are you bouncing around to include in there.
Thank you, Michael. Well, you're right. We had, the governor had proposed his January budget. For the last few months, we were supposed to be debating it, having hearings over it, and then submit something and have it approved by June. So we've lost 2 months of that kind of face-to-face debate and conversation amongst us all with the best of ideas. Our ability to have new spending in the budget is going to be pretty much, mostly curtailed as far as additional. We're going to be working with a baseline type of budget. But that doesn't mean we can't have the budget reflect our priorities and our values. And we've got to keep reminding ourselves of that. One, I think there's a few things is that we could keep looking at our investments as a government, as a state, by looking at the creation of good jobs. We don't have to go to the rock bottom of saying, well, the states, and the country is in economic trouble, so let's just keep creating more poverty. We have the ability to do something else. So I think that's why in our recent meetings, we've been talking a lot about housing production and affordable housing. I hope the emphasis is on affordable housing production. That will deal with the crisis, but at the same time, it'll create quality jobs and pathways to careers. So what some good portion of our budget should continue to go to that and not cut it off. I think we should also be creative. Somebody mentioned creativity with our procurement process. We've learned, for example, that why aren't we doing more manufacturing and manufacturing in a way that's beneficial to our economy? And that's both with, goods like our PPE, but it's also with things that are important for our environment, like, electric buses or the cars for the trains for mass transit. I mean, those are the things that should be done in California. Why are we investing and giving away billions and billions of dollars to companies that are not creating jobs in this state? So I think we need to take a stronger look at that. We have to make sure our public dollars are actually investing in our communities. And we've had a couple of examples of that in Northern California, 2 companies that were set up with our LA Metro, with our dollars down here, was done in such a way that close to 2,000 jobs were created, assembly, not even the full manufacturing, but at least assembly. So in my mind, it stands out as we should be doing a lot more production and manufacturing in this state. So those are just a couple of the ideas that I think are being, looked at. Resiliency, and climate, we should look at that as job creator and not as something that's going to be limited in scope, but actually could be much broader in scope. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Cynthia, is there something else you'd want to add to the senator's to-do list? Not just for her, of course, but all of her colleagues.
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator, it's very exciting as a policy advocate to hear those, and we stand ready to support those proposals if we can. I just wanted to add that given what we've already said about the vulnerability, especially of communities of color and immigrant families, I want to make a plug for two major campaigns that we are a part of, and which Senator Durazo actually is leading in the legislature, and that's the Health for All campaign. And right now, it's the campaign to provide access to medical for undocumented seniors, as well as including individual tax identification number filers in the California Earned Income Tax Credit. These are COVID responses. If you include these populations, you are helping not only protect many vulnerable members of our society who are our workers as well, but you're going to help them be part of the workforce that is going to help revive California's economy. There's already a lot of creative initiatives that have come out of different counties, but there are also a few that I just wanted to flag, both at the state and at the federal level, because right now it's very urgent. This includes expanding access to free COVID testing and treatment for everyone. If it's possible to do that through emergency Medicaid, regardless of immigration status, that would be a life-saving measure. Protecting workers, including automatically extending work permits for recipients of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, TPS workers or the temporary protected status workers, as well as making sure that agricultural workers are actually not deported at this moment. The other one is making sure that we place restrictions on immigration detention and enforcement, because the detention centers are some of the most vulnerable places where this pandemic is taking shape. And at the same time, we are deporting populations who are bringing the virus to the countries where they come from. These are like the real health equity and economic equity issues that will help our communities thrive if we can only just do that even in the short term. And finally, because I know that with the latest, I have to say this, the latest immigration ban that's been issued as an executive order is really causing a lot of anxiety and discouragement in the immigrant community, and we are going to fight that. We will make sure that we provide a strong reaction to that. But let's include refugees in the way we think about assistance. There are many vulnerable refugee populations that are also excluded since we stopped accepting asylum seekers and since we significantly reduced assistance and resettlement opportunities for these populations. Remember, conflicts around the world hasn't stopped. And California can do the right thing by calling on its best self and its fundamental values of making sure that if we can expand the pie, then the quality of life outcomes of many of us in our communities will also include those populations I was talking about.
Thank you. Jose, would love some of your thoughts. When I think of Mission Asset Fund, I think of innovation and addressing the financial challenges and lending challenges for low-income populations. I'm wondering if you have some ideas that you'd like to share, especially as we think about people being more vulnerable at times like these to predatory lending, to foreclosures, just losing kind of some of the few assets that they've worked so hard to build up. Anyway, curious as to your thoughts on policy prescriptions to address those issues and anything else.
We support, what Senator Durazo said. We have to do this because there's so many things that we need to do for sure. I also want to applaud the governor's office for putting out that $75 million contribution to workers. I consider that money is very precious money that is very significant, help right now, and I hope that help in any way, which way I can, to make sure that that there's an efficient way of distributing those resources to people, directly to people, and so definitely want to sort of put that out there, because I definitely have the ability, the capacity, the technology to make that happen. I think that if I can offer one idea in terms of policy recommendations, is that like thinking about checking accounts as utilities. Not just perceived access in the way that we have it now, where banks or credit unions offer checking accounts, and we think that everybody has access, but in reality, we all don't. There's the unbanked, in our community is a significant issue, because they can't get checking accounts, either because they have no social security number or they have an I-10. I mean, some banks and credit unions actually do not open up checking accounts for people with I-10 numbers or without. And so they institute those barriers, thinking that have. So I think if we were to sort of making the way we conceive as utilities, which is like everybody's grid, if you will, I think a checking account, it should be something that we all should be able to have, because as we see now, people that are not plugged in, people that are not, they don't have that account, it's actually harder to reach them with any sort of assistance, right? And it's not just for us as MAP, but it's something that we heard from even the federal government, right? The IRS said that they'll send the check, and maybe they'll get the check in 2-3 months' time, for people that don't have checking accounts. So, but I think it requires a revisioning or reconceptualizing about what exactly is that tool. And then if we think of it as a utility that is fundamental to the functioning of our society, then I think we should then have more of an argument to make sure that everybody gets banked, and everybody matters. Just one idea.
And that's a great one. Very innovative. I love that, banking as a utility. So I'm going to scratch the last question I had, because we've got great questions coming from our viewers, and I want to go to those. Let's go to our first question, which one of my backstage colleagues will put up on the screen. There we are. So with the president's new public charge rule, many of our undocumented folks are afraid to use any government assistance, even amid this pandemic. So how can we address this? Thank you, Brianna Ruiz, for sending that in. Cynthia, I know that CIPC, California Immigrant Policy Center, has been on part of the forefront in terms of combating the new public charge rule. So I'd love to go to you on this one to get your thoughts.
All right, real quickly, I just want to say at the outset that right now, COVID testing is not considered a public charge. So if you're afraid, don't, and get yourself tested if you need to be tested, and if that opportunity is available. You are absolutely right that this has had a continuing chilling effect on how people access benefits and access the safety net. What we have been doing as advocates, and actually in partnership with legislators and the state government, is to continue pushing the information, factual, accurate information on the ground, even during the shelter-at-home period. We're doing virtual community outreach activities, have translated enormous amounts of documents about public charge and how people can continue to access their benefits in about 21 languages. These materials are available. I encourage you to contact us. Our website is going to be displayed at the end of this conversation, and you have a way to email us and ask that information, because I want to make sure that we give you the full complex explanation, and not in these few minutes that we have left here.
Yeah, thank you. Did anybody else want to speak to this question? Otherwise, we'll go to the next one.
I also just want to add, if I can, Michael, that the distribution of the new fund will also not fall under the public charge rule. So there are many ways in which our communities, insufficient amounts and insufficient programs, without a doubt, does not meet our needs. But whatever programs, there are many programs out there that are not subject to the public charge rule. So the best thing to do is to advise our community to ask, and then they'll get the right answer for their particular case, for their particular program.
Great, thank you. Are we ready with our next question? Here we are from Landon Dickey. Are there early projections as to how COVID-19 and the potential recession to follow will impact job reductions? And on the flip side, growth of certain jobs and industries. David, I'd love to turn to you on this one. Of course, we've heard that amidst this rising unemployment, we've heard of grocery stores, delivery services, certain other sectors that are hiring. So would love to get your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Michael. First of all, I'm not an economist, so I wouldn't purport to be good at sort of predicting all this. And as I said earlier, I think a dose of humility is in order for those that are actually economists and others. I don't think any of us really know, because we don't know what opening an economy from this status when COVID is not going away, what it's going to look like, and what does social distancing look like when you're trying to figure out, does a beauty, like they found out in Georgia, when we say to someone who's a beauty shop or a barber shop, you can open, no one knows. But having said that, I mean, I think there are sectors that are likely to be robust and maybe available to driving economic growth, and possible places where we can see better equity, the good jobs that Senator Durazo talked about. Healthcare clearly is a huge sector, and it's a sector that can be an equalizer in terms of making sure everybody has access to it regardless of your income. Education will, in an economy we're in a recession, what we often see is a lot of students go back to community colleges. So we should see our whole educational sector, from childcare all the way through the post-secondary and training, to be actually a place that could be a job growth. And we should invest in it to make sure that it is, for many reasons. One, it can lead job growth. Two, it's of course good for us to provide investments in educating and taking care of our infants and toddlers and young adults. So that's just to name a few. Tourism will be slower, I think, but it still is important. Our service economy, we know, matters. We have to eat, we have to get food, we have to do a lot of things that are service jobs. So I think we don't know that yet, but there's all sorts of potential, and we need to be very aggressive in having stimulus monies go to those kind of sectors and those kind of jobs that are going to lead to more equitable growth as we recover.
All right. I'd love to fit in one more question, but did anybody else want to touch on this one before we go to the next question?
I just want to add, in terms of temporarily, there's this new word, repurposing, and some industries repurposing are within their own industry into different sectors. So, for example, I know in the hospitality industry, they have the Hospitality Training Academy, who are joining with employers to make the big kitchens and hotels available to prepare meals. Those meals, which of course are having to be delivered to seniors or to people who are ill or elderly who can't get out. Or for the children. Our school district is providing more meals, not just to the children like what they're used to, but they're actually providing meals to the parents as well. So there's all these temporary, but I think that temporary meaning that they will come back. Hospitality, travel, and tourism will come back. It'll take a couple of years, but it will come back. And construction, certainly, pathways, technology, these personal services, childcare providers. We need many, many more childcare providers than from what we have. The demand is great. So there's a lot of industries and jobs that are going to be here, maybe some new ones, but let's not forget the ones that already exist.
Thank you, Senator. So let's take, we can just real quickly, last question here from Richard Roberts. A lot of these positive moves are seizing on the opportunity of the collective threat of COVID-19. What can we do to ensure that the collective spirit of this moment lives on past the crisis? This is a great closing question. I think just to everyone, and we've touched on some of these, but just if everyone wants to spend maybe just half a minute, since we're at time, whoever wants to go first.
I just want to put a plug in for the California Volunteer Corps, Josh Friday, who's been doing a tremendous job. We could, in a good way, institutionalize the best parts and keep the human spirit of more and more people connecting with their neighbors, connecting with us, our communities, and doing a lot more of that kind of work that has been boosted during this pandemic, during this crisis.
Great.
I'll jump in and just kind of talk about this community spread notion. It reminds me of the immunization crisis that we had over the last few years. I think we have to help us all find the better side of ourselves, which is if we don't do what's good for the community, we are all at risk. And so this has really put a punctuation on that. And I think it's a beautiful thing when we actually rise above our own self-interest and we see that if we become part of the whole, we're all better off. And that's actually a more fulfilling way to live anyway.
All right. Cynthia?
I just want to say that for us, we've been using this term shared humanity, and it has been an amazing paradoxical experience where more people are starting to feel more connected while we are physically distant. I think shared humanity should result to the notion of shared dignity, and only then can we really come up with this California project about California for all. And I think the state, our leaders in the state, the leaders in this conversation have a big role to play in making that happen.
Right. Jose, I'm going to turn to you to close it out for us. And just before that, just thanking all of you for joining us today, thanking you for everything that you do for Californians. So Jose, close us out with your thoughts.
And I want to thank you, Michael, for bringing us together in such a time. Because I think this is an important conversation that we need to have. And again, thank fellow panelists for contributing your thoughts, because I think that's exactly the type of hope that we need to discuss. And I think for me, it is a question of like just really reminding ourselves of our shared humanity, that we've been in situations like this or worse situations like this before in the history of humanity. And the one thing that carries through is that we recognize a shared love, the shared mutuality of ourselves, the idea that our survival, it depends on one another. And I think if we remind ourselves of those ideas, I think we'll weather through this crisis and then have the potential of rebuilding the society in one that is true to our values as Californians. And so I'm hopeful about that, and I'm actually very excited to be part of that effort as well. And so, and that's what kind of keeps me going, in the moments of despair. But in that same process, we have to be involved, we have to be engaged, we have to be part of the solution, and not just complaining about what is happening. But it's like we have to do something. And so, thank you for bringing us together to have this conversation. And I definitely would love to kind of continue the conversation with anybody that wants to help bring immediate relief, cash relief, to the millions of immigrants that are hurting right now. So I want to just leave with that open invitation on the table.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, and to our audience. Again, thank you so much for joining. Stay safe, stay healthy. And we look forward to you joining us again in the future.
Thank you so much.
Bless.